Help support The Candid Frame in bringing you awesome conversations with great photographers. You can do this by contributing as little as $2 a month to our Patreon campaign. That modest donation helps us to bring a quality show to you every week. Contribute today by visiting patreon.com/The Candid Frame. This is Ibarian and this is The Candid Frame. Photographer Matt Payne did not grow up wealthy. He always had a roof over his head and food on the table, but there were times when he could see that his parents struggled financially. What his parents lacked in finances, they made up for with their love of the outdoors, which they shared with their son. They took advantage of the natural beauty that their home in Colorado had to offer. And with the aid of his stepfather, Matt had climbed his first 14,000-foot mountain by the age of 6. Those regular summer outings resulted in some wonderful memories, but it also instilled in him a deep-held respect for nature that has informed his choices as a photographer.
How you're raised and the reasons that you go up into these places and into nature, I think it informs your motivation later in life. You know, I remember my parents, we would go up into the mountains all the time, and you'd see people that would carve their names into aspen trees with a knife. It'd be there forever, right? And the tree would just die, basically. As far as back as I can remember, it's like, never, ever, ever do that. And I was like, yes, Mom, like, I will never do that, right? I guess what I'm trying to say is it informs your motivations as a photographer later in life. So when I go out with my camera to these places in nature, I'm not thinking about, like, what can I do in order to maximize my financial gain? Or what can I do in order to get the most likes on Instagram? Or how do I make it to where I get more people following me on Facebook or whatever? Like, my motivations aren't about money or fame or business, you know, even though that stuff can follow naturally, I think. If you're passionate enough, people will see that. But what I'm doing is I'm experiencing these places and just loving where I'm at and trying to capture those moments and share them with other people and for myself, for my future, so I can look back and like, oh, that was one of the most amazing mountain climbs I've ever done, and I really want to remember that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, your motivations can be informed by your past experiences. And I think, like you said, what I'm seeing a lot of times is that in this digital age right now is people are motivated more about fame and Instagram likes.
As a photographer, Matt began to experience the natural world in a different way. But he's always had a keen awareness that nature, the wild, exists on its own terms. And it's not just there for people to take pretty pictures. Learning to put aside his own expectations has helped him to embrace what Mother Nature has to offer.
Some of my best photographs have come out of situations where maybe the light wasn't as good, or, you know, the thing that you were planning on shooting didn't really materialize, but then it forces you to kind of think differently about the scene. Or, you know, what if I hiked over there and saw what was on the other side of that hillside or up on that ridge, and then you're like, oh my God, why didn't I do this to begin with? So I think if we go out into the fields and just have an open mind about what we'll find, it really does help open up the possibilities. But I think it forces you to try things that maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. But like you said, it will help inform future images and be a better photographer in the long run.
We'll talk to Matt about how becoming a father himself has impacted his photography and how his own podcast, F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen, provides him a personal source for inspiration. And later, I'll introduce you to a new segment that revolves around shells, a little blonde girl, and dreaming the impossible. Welcome to The Candid Frame. Well, thanks for sitting down with me and chatting with me. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah.
I want to start talking about your beginnings, because I know that your stepdad played a real big role in you and your experience of the outdoors. And I think it's always interesting to see how people, through the relationship with their parent, whether it's their dad or their mother or stepmother or whatever the situation is, get instilled with something that they carry through the rest of their lives. That somehow that little germ of activity that's shared makes a huge difference. And I know that that's part of your story, but I really would like you to share with us, about those beginnings, not just about the activity, but the relationship, because I think that really plays a big role in terms of why you love the landscape and nature, and not just photographing nature so much.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for me, it's like, because I'm a parent also, and just listening to what you just said, it reminded me of just how much power and influence we have as adults with children. When I was growing up, my parents, especially my stepdad, really instilled a value of appreciating nature, but not just like, let's go on hikes. It was like every time we would show up to a campsite, we would spend the first 2 or 3 hours cleaning the campsite up. And we would haul away all kinds of trash that people had left behind. We would clean up fire rings that people had left. We would just make the place better than the way we found it. Mm-hmm. And when I was growing up, I was like, oh, that's fine. That makes sense. It's, we want this place to be nice for our camp experience today. But I guess I didn't really fully appreciate what it is they were instilling in me at the time. And looking back on it, it's when you have someone that you look up to every day of your life showing you how to, through their actions, mm-hmm. how to take care of a place, and how to think about a place and how to appreciate a place, it really changes your relationship with that place and with nature. So, that those values are carried by me today, and I have to thank my parents for that. And it's not just the values of wanting nature to stay pristine and doing whatever you can in order to further that cause. It's also, I feel like as adults, when we expose children to these places at an early age, and we show them how amazing these places can be, it plants a seed in their mind that I think can grow into this huge tree of appreciation later in their life that I think is what's often missing with some people that you see visiting these places as adults, that maybe not their own fault, but they didn't have those experiences growing up, and so they don't necessarily have the same values and the same kind of thought process about a place and about the outdoors. So I strongly believe in whatever we can do to educate kids and get them out into nature and show them what's amazing about those places and what their role is in protecting those places and making it so that they can experience those places the same way, and their kids and their kids' kids, and so on and so forth.
How old were you when your stepfather came into your life?
I think I was less than 1 year old. So,
okay.
Yeah, he adopted me when I was 5. I remember that because I got to come out of school that day. So I remember that. But yeah, for all intents and purposes, he was my dad. Mm-hmm. So I never really thought about him as my stepdad. But he was always very clear. He always wanted me to call him by his first name, Ray. So I always called him Ray, and everyone around me always thought that was weird. Like, why are you calling your dad Ray? It's funny.
You said that you guys, weren't particularly well off, and that was partly the reason why you guys ended up spending so much time in the outdoors. Describe to me what your life was like in terms of limited income. What did that look like?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a roller coaster, to be perfectly honest. Neither of my parents had a college education. My mom didn't even have her GED until much later in life. So they were always working blue-collar jobs that often would, based on the economy, like they would get laid off. And so it was very volatile. And my parents did a great job of kind of shielding me from that. They did the best they could in terms of making sure we always had food and shelter and things like that. But it was always very apparent to me that we did not have extra money for anything else. You know what I mean? Like, we could pay our rent. We had super old clunky vehicles that would break down constantly. And so, kind of in a side story, like now as an adult, whenever I have vehicle problems, I just get really nervous because that was just my experience growing up. Like it would just be very disruptive. Even if I have money now, it's like I still have that mentality in the back of my head that, oh, this is going to be really bad,
Yeah.
But yeah, so I remember, I think I was in 8th grade. No. I was in 6th grade. Both of my parents got laid off at the exact same time. And so it was just, I remember we would go to like food banks and, we were asking friends and family to help just with the basics. So it just, I don't know, when you grow up in that environment, you have a much different appreciation for the stuff that I think most of us take for granted every day.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have just a different mentality that informs your behaviors. Not necessarily all good either. There's a lot of research out there showing, people that live in poverty, you make really bad decisions because all you can focus on is the short-term needs that you have, and you can't plan ahead, and your brain, it's like scarcity. There was a whole podcast on Hidden Brain about that, which was really good. But yeah, so I think growing up in that lifestyle and that environment, it definitely informed a lot of who I am today and the types of things that I appreciate and the types of things that I necessarily don't, how do I say this? I have different attitudes about wealth and, people that do have lots of means, which is definitely my own personal bias based on the way that I grew up. So, but yeah, it definitely informs a lot of the way that my brain works.
Yeah. Well, I commend your parents for creating a situation where you guys still had a shared experience. Because as you said, when you're living in poverty, when you're living under limited means, the luxury of spending quality time as a family becomes even more difficult, right? And it's wonderful that you guys were able to utilize the outdoors to have that sort of shared experience, to have sort of a reprieve from all the financial challenges that you were facing, and to have an experience that extended throughout your life.
Yeah.
It's really, really nice.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I definitely would be a completely different person. And I even look at my own son who has he's 10 and he's had a much different experience than I have growing up. He's never had to worry about that kind of stuff. It's just interesting to see like the stuff that he thinks about, like, oh, I've never been to Hawaii, Dad. Like, wow. Yeah, I never saw the ocean until I was 30 years old. So, like you have it so easy, buddy. You don't even know.
Your experiences in the outdoors weren't just these camping trips. You would go on these hikes where you're going pretty high altitudes and sort of navigating these peaks, which I think is really interesting, especially I wonder even as a young kid whether I would have wanted to or could have done, some of the things that you did. That seems to have been a real big part of your experience. Why were those important? And if you could explain it a little better than I did, what you did and why it was so important.
Well, I mean, we're very fortunate in Colorado that a lot of the mountains that are in Colorado are pretty accessible by road in terms of, you can get to a trailhead that is at 10, 11,000 feet by car, which is great. In some ways, it's bad in others that we could talk about later, but in terms of the masses of people that go to those places because of that ease of access. Mm-hmm. But I mean, essentially, you're camping 9,000, 10,000 feet and then hiking up to 13,000, 14,000 feet. Back then, there wasn't, a lot of the mountains didn't have a lot of trails. So, you're learning route finding, you're going up like 45-degree vertical pitch on boulders and rocks that are loose. And so like you have to learn how to identify rocks that are loose versus rocks that are stable. And how do you down climb those? Mm-hmm. And you have to be careful about how the weather, because the biggest risk up there is the weather, in my opinion, because in the afternoon, the inversion happens and all the heat rises up into the clouds and it creates huge thunderstorms that just come out of nowhere within like 15 minutes that you can't really predict. So you have to constantly be aware of your surroundings, and I don't know, it's you're like on an adventure every weekend, right? Like I'm trying to answer your question, because I was just more just explaining
Yeah,
what it's like.
But that's a good example, because I think that experience and that awareness of nature instills a level of respect for it that I think is often lacking by the people who go there casually. I just saw a video today of some guy who got out of his car to taunt a buffalo. I don't know exactly where it was, but I was just like, one, that's stupid. Two, it's totally stressful and for the animal itself. Granted, there are a bunch of cars on the road that the buffalo was trying to sort of navigate, but there's this sort of disrespect, obliviousness to nature and its potential to not only harm us, but for us to do harm to it. And I think that as much as people say that they love nature, I think that there's a certain level of obliviousness and disrespect that happens far too often, especially in the Instagram age, where all people are concerned about is getting a snapshot and don't care about anything else. So I think, go ahead.
It's it's as you're saying that, I'm thinking, your how you're raised and the reasons that you go up into these places and into nature. I think it informs your motivation later in life. So like you take someone like me, I was lucky enough to have those experiences early on and gain that appreciation of these places and have a healthy respect for what nature can do to you, but also have a healthy respect for how easily I can have an impact on nature, in terms of, I remember my parents, we would go up into the mountains all the time, and you'd see people that would carve their names into aspen trees with a knife. And it'd be there forever, right? And the tree would just die, basically. And so, as far as back as I can remember, it's like, never, ever, ever do that. And I was like, yes, Mom, I will never do that, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say is, it informs your motivations as a photographer later in life. So, when I go out with my camera to these places in nature, I'm not thinking about, what can I do in order to maximize my financial gain? Or what can I do in order to get the most likes on Instagram? Or how do I make it to where I get more people following me on Facebook or whatever? My motivations aren't about money or fame or or business, even though that stuff can follow naturally. I think if you're passionate enough, people will see that. But what I'm doing is I'm just there, I'm experiencing these places and just loving where I'm at and trying to capture those moments and share them with other people and for myself, for my future, so I can look back and that was one of the most amazing mountain climbs I've ever done, and I really want to remember that. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is your motivations can be informed by your past experiences. And I think, like you said, what I'm seeing a lot of times is that in this digital age right now is people are motivated more about fame and Instagram likes and things. And not everyone, obviously. I mean, right. I'm overly generalizing for sure, but I've actually put a lot of thought into this particular challenge because, it doesn't do us any good to just go out there and tell people you're taking photos for the wrong reasons. Who am I to say why you should be taking pictures and what motivates you as an artist? That's just not right, in my opinion. But what I can do is I can help people maybe slow down and do some introspection into why are you taking photos? What purpose do these photographs have? What is driving your behavior right now? Is it that you want people to thumb up your video on YouTube or on Facebook or is it because you want to share your personal experience with nature, with others, and with yourself? So I think my advice for people would be, slow down and think about why are you doing this? Is a good reason?
Yeah. You said initially that you picked up a camera because you wanted to document your hikes and your treks. When did you start thinking of more than just a documentary practice and think about it as a more creative outlet?
I think at one point in time, I was, I remember I was on this backpacking trip with the camera that I had that I really couldn't shoot RAW. But I'd read a little bit about what RAW could do. I really wanted to try to take a picture of this mountain at night. But my camera ISO only went to like 800 or something, and I was like, I just want to do more with this. I want to show how beautiful this is, but the equipment that I have is limiting me. So I guess it was through my relationship with these places and my experiences that I wanted to do more and more in terms of showing off the real beauty of these places, and not just from a, hey, here's a picture of that mountain. It's like I want to really, as best I can, show these places off in the best possible way, in the most realistic way, which early on my photos were very overly processed. I think that's a pretty common thing for most landscape photographers. But I guess the other thing was I'd come back from these places that a lot of people haven't been to, and I'd show off these pictures and they'd be like, wow, these are amazing. Do you sell your photos? Like, what are you going to do? And, you know, as more and more people came to appreciate the photos I was taking, it kind of was a light bulb that went off that maybe this could be more for me. You know, maybe it's not just about documenting my trips. Maybe it could be more of a deeper expression of my relationship with these places.
And were you already aware of the other landscape photographers, not just the current ones, but from the ones in the past that had already produced a body of work, or did that come as a result of you beginning your forays into producing images yourself?
Yeah, it's funny. I look back on my early days as a photographer, and I don't remember looking at a lot of other people's photographs. I really wasn't aware of, you know, who the popular photographers were, or even just techniques for taking pictures. That came later when I was really trying to learn how to. Getting out of auto mode, and you're shooting raw, and it's like, oh, what's a good composition look like? And that all came later when I was researching and trying to educate myself on how to take better photos. So yeah, I didn't really have a strong interest in photography and other people's photos until I started getting more into it.
Yeah. What do you think was one of the more difficult things to learn? Was there a particular aspect of landscape photography that was a big catalyst for you taking it from one level to another level? Can you point to a particular element, whether it was in the creation of the images or in post-processing that was that for you?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably a combination of three different things. The first was, learning the exposure triangle and understanding the relationship between aperture and ISO and shutter speed, and getting out of auto and shooting in manual. And then also shooting in RAW and learning what tools were available in order to manipulate the RAW file, in order to accentuate certain aspects of the image that you wanted to bring out or to show to other people. And then I guess thirdly was I had a insatiable appetite to consume other people's images, and I would spend a lot of time, I remember, looking at other people's images that I really liked and then asking myself, how did they do that? Which then forced me to experiment and try to do things to emulate what I saw in other people's images that I liked. So it's kind of a combination of those three things.
Yeah. One of the things that I came to really appreciate about outdoor landscape photography was not only the attention that these photographers would put into the quality of the light, but the determination and the persistence they had to have when they would hike into a location that wasn't just a couple of footsteps away from their car and face the possibility that all those things wouldn't come together. I mean, for me, I would be like, wow, that is a degree of patience and persistence that I don't know I would always have, but it has to be an important part of being a nature photographer.
For sure.
Talk to me about developing that kind of sensibility, and how do you sort of optimize your circumstances so that when you do go out and you go hiking and you go to a location that may require you hours to get to, that it pays off, even though there's really no guarantee that it will.
Yeah, it's I would say it's a meticulous exercise in planning and expectation management. I can remember early on and when I first had my first DSLR and when I finally got a full frame camera and I was really getting serious into it, and I was doing a lot of trips to relatively iconic locations close-ish to where I lived, and you had this kind of pre-planned vision of, I'm going to capture this amazing sunrise at Garden of the Gods or at this location or that location, or I'm going to go to this place. And like, you have all these pre-visualized notions of what it is you're going to photograph and see. And then you get there and like 75-80% of the time that stuff doesn't happen. All right. Mm-hmm. So I can remember several times where I was incredibly discouraged as a photographer and almost gave up because it was just, and I made the mistake of looking at what other people were doing all the time, like, which I think can be a very dangerous thing as an artist, is to spend a lot of time worrying about what others are doing. Mm-hmm. So I would be looking at other people's images like, gosh, you always get the greatest light, right? Like, how the hell do you do that? And then you're like, oh, it's because they don't have a full-time job and they don't have kids and they don't have a family. And like, you just start having all of this negative self-talk about like, well, that they can do that because they have way more time than I do. And, and they're just luckier than I am, right? But really, where I've come to grow as an artist over the last couple of years is when I go out on these trips now, I don't have any expectations of what I'm going to bring back. And I'm much, much more open to finding scenes or finding shots that may not be in good lights, or maybe it's an abstract of a pine cone on the ground, or maybe it's a particular way that a tree is shaped or something like that. Like, I'm much more open to finding images that speak to me instead of seeking out a very specific composition that I saw someone else take and then being super disappointed because the light wasn't right. So I think it's really helped me a lot in terms of enjoying landscape photography, but also just it takes you to different places as an artist that it opens up your creative side, and it forces you to just see things differently. And the cool thing is you can take photos when the light isn't good, and that's fun, right? Like, that's why we're doing this, is it's supposed to be fun. So I think if people just had very low expectations of what it is they're actually going to take a picture of, it will go a long way in terms of keeping you open-minded, but also keeping you sane.
I have the exact same approach when it comes to street photography. Yeah. I want to go out there, and sometimes the light is just not there. And it's like, well, I'm here. What am I going to do? And it used to be I would come home just pissed. Oh, the light sucked. I didn't get what I thought I was going to get, and it was all a wash. And I was actually writing something this morning, and I talked about this whole idea that there are never really any bad photographs, because even with the bad photographs, I'm learning something. And right. It's the practice of going out there and making pictures. And even though the great majority of them don't work, those photographs end up informing how I see and how I photograph. So their value may not be immediately seen when I blow up that image on the computer screen. But over time, it becomes an accumulation of information, of experience that ends up leading me to be able to make a photograph that leverages all those things that I'm always in the hunt for, because I've had to face situations where I didn't have them and yet still had to pull out a good image. So I appreciate that in landscape photography, but even more so because of all that hiking and all that gear that you normally have to go out there, carrying, not just camera equipment, but, stuff for your safety, or if you're going to be out there for multiple days camping. And man, I'm a simple man. I just want one camera, one lens, and I'm good.
Yeah, what's funny, I don't know about you though, but some of my best photographs have come out of situations where maybe the light wasn't as good, or you didn't have or the thing that you were planning on shooting didn't really materialize, but then it forces you to kind of think differently about the scene, or what if I hiked over there and saw what was on the other side of that hillside or up on that ridge, and then you're like, oh my God, why didn't I do this to begin with? So I think if we go out into the fields and just have an open mind about what we'll find, it really does help open up the possibilities. But I think it forces you to try things that maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. But like you said, it will help inform future images and be a better photographer in the long run.
You mentioned, being married and having a son. And I think when you're young and single, getting up and going out and making photographs is no problem. You can go anytime as long as you got gas money and you got film or enough charged batteries, you go to it and make photographs. But you get married, you have kids, maybe multiple kids, throw in a dog, and it becomes all the more difficult to do all that stuff. And a lot of people end up using that as an excuse for not creating those kinds of pictures, right?
Absolutely.
But you've managed to do that because you're not working full time as a professional landscape photographer, but you nevertheless, I see your body of work. You've been pretty consistent in terms of producing a good amount of work that's really quality, top-notch stuff. So what have been some of the more personal things that you had to learn to do in order to maintain your passion and the time for your photography?
Yeah, so gosh, well, it's become even more difficult now that I do a weekly podcast, as you're probably equally as challenged there as well. But I think I'm going to go way back in time here, and I was actually really influenced and got a lot out of an episode of your podcast, probably 2011 with Jay and Verena Patel.
Oh, yeah. Huh.
And I remember I was sitting by the pool in Kauai, I think, listening to that, or I think that's where I was.
Okay.
And I remember you asked a similar question of them, and what they said was really formative to me at the time and still is today. And that is you don't always have to be out taking photos. What's important is that when you do go out, that you maximize your ability to bring back a good image. So, for example, this year, I've probably only gone out to take photos maybe 5 or 6 times total, but each time I bring back at least 1 or 2 photos that I like. And so for me, it's not about sacrificing things in your personal life or gosh, sorry, I can't go to your play or your musical performance, son, because I'm going to be taking photos for the next 4 weeks, which, don't get me wrong, that sounds awesome to be able to do that, but, I can't. So instead, what I've tried to do is just find at least 3 or 4 times a year that I can devote several days at a time and just maximize that time and then go into it with very low expectations. So I don't know if that answered your question at all.
No, that makes sense because I think it's like for me, I've been keeping track of my productivity throughout the year. And what I've been doing is I've been doing these quarterly assessments of my work. And I've recently put a YouTube video where I talk about this sort of process. So I can take a look at, not only how many photographs I've made, but what kinds of photographs I've made and starting to collect the pictures that I really like so that at the end of the year, when I choose my year's best, I will have already sort of started the process. And this past month that we just finished, I hardly shot anything. Right? Because there was just a bunch of different stuff that came up. I was finishing a book. My mother-in-law's moving in with us. Her vehicles,
that sounds fun.
her vehicles are in my driveway. I'm trying to sell them. The water heater went out. The AC went out when it was 102 degrees outside. It was just so much stuff that required me just to sort of sit here. So when I looked at the images from last month, there was virtually nothing. Even though I had my camera with me, I was just so distracted from all of that. But I still had the perspective of everything else that I'd done throughout the year. And just like you described, I haven't taken a big trip so far. I'm going to take one in September. But what little time I did have, I still was able to produce some really good work. And even though it may have been just 15 minutes that day or half an hour that day, I was okay, let me leverage this time and try to make as good an image as I can. If for nothing else, just to keep in practice. just to make sure that I'm carefully seeing, even though the circumstances may not be ideal. It's like, how can I make the most of it? And that's, even though we practice a different type of photography, we're still talking the same language when it comes to that.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, there's times where I don't know if you feel the same way, but I know a lot of landscape photographers get this way, where you might go weeks or months where you just don't have any motivation to take photos for whatever reason. And then it'll just strike you like, I need to go out and take some photos. And so for me, I kind of ebb and flow that way. Like I'll go through a period of time where I want to take photos every single day for a month. And then I'll go through other phases where I don't want to take any photos for the next 2 months. I don't necessarily understand why that is. Like I can't target a specific reason. I think it's kind of one of those things like I really want to do that and I really don't. And I guess the other thing that's, with landscape, it's really hard to just pick up your camera and go take some photos, like at least good photos. Like you have to, at least for my own personal standards, like typically you have to travel a little bit out of town and find a location or go to a place that you've kind of had in the back of your mind. Like I remember when I first moved here to Durango, I drove up this county road a few times and I remember thinking like, this would be a cool shot, like right here. So I kind of do that too. I catalog as I'm kind of out and about. I catalog different places that I think that place would be kind of interesting, and I just kind of keep that in the back of my mind, or I might make a note on my phone or something like this would be a cool spot. And then when I'm feeling that itch and the light looks like it might be good, or the weather's looking interesting or something, then I'll have something that I can quickly say like, okay, there was that one spot, I'm going to go to that one spot that I remember. So that's been helpful too, is just kind of having a running list of ideas in the back of my mind that I can go to whenever I feel the itch.
As people started saying that they really loved your images, and whether you sell prints, you eventually started, selling prints, that can be a real difficult transition to make because you're making photographs for your own pleasure, for your own satisfaction. All of a sudden, people show an interest in purchasing a print. And then the challenge becomes putting a monetary value to your work, right? So tell me about you sort of coming to terms with that in terms of, okay, how do I navigate this? How do I sell them? What sizes do I make? How much do I charge for these things? That sometimes is just as difficult as making the photographs, if not more so. But tell me about your experience.
Yeah, well, I don't know if anyone else has had this challenge, but early on when I actually started getting print sales and things like that, it definitely shifted my attention a little bit in a direction that I didn't like. It was forcing me to go out and take images of places that I maybe normally wouldn't be interested in, just because I knew it would be something that people might buy. And then on top of that, I was also processing the images in ways that I look back on and I'm like, the only reason I did that is because I thought it would sell more. Like it doesn't make the photo better. So it tainted me as an artist. Just in retrospect, it definitely did that. So I'd say in the last year and a half or so, I've kind of stepped back from that and focused less on shooting for what I think would sell a print and focus more on taking pictures of things that I think would be interesting to myself. And if those two things come together, that's awesome. And if they don't, oh well. Perfectly honest with you, I think when I look back on the last year and a half of my photographs, they're much better photos because the reason why I'm taking them is just much more from an artistic perspective and of self-fulfillment. And then to answer your question, like how do you figure out how much to sell prints for? I'll let you know when I figure that out. But I mean, I don't know. It's a funny thing. Like I actually have done a lot of reading about that. I bought a couple of years ago, that Elaine Brio book about marketing fine art photography, and that was sort of helpful in terms of thinking about just, how do you price your work and what's the approach you should take in terms of maximizing your income in terms of selling prints, which I think that book was written before there was today there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of talented artists out there, and the value of the photograph, I think, has diminished a little bit. But I've definitely found a niche market of people that really like going into the mountains and like want to remember those places as well. So that's typically the people that buy my photos, is people that have a super appreciation of Colorado mountains and the places that I've been as well. So I do a lot of research, like what are other people selling prints for, people that I appreciate or I like their work, and I try to figure out like, okay, I don't want to overprice my work, because then you're gonna make it to where people that maybe don't have a ton of money can't buy your work, but then you also don't want to undersell yourself, because A, you'll never make any money, which kind of sucks, and then B, there's this weird mentality out there that if it's priced too low, it's not worth something.
Right.
It's kind of a funny thing. I know, like I know several photographers that price their work very, very high because they're going to attract those kinds of buyers. So it's an interesting dilemma that I think most landscape photographers struggle with.
Yeah, it's part science, part voodoo, I think.
It is, for sure. It is.
Well, you've been doing a podcast like me, where you interview photographers. And it's a weekly podcast. Why the hell would you do that? When I started, I didn't know any better, right? Now it's just like, oh my God, I can't imagine starting a podcast now. But what spurred you to want to do it yourself?
Well, so when I originally started the podcast, I didn't set any goals in terms of how many I would put out a week or a month or a year. And I also didn't set any financial goals for the podcast at all. It was just it was like a passion project, and it still is. But I would say back in January, I got laid off from my job, and I kind of was trying to figure out, like, maybe this podcast and photography can be more of my main income. So that's at that time is when I said, okay, I want to produce a podcast a week. I want to produce extra content on Patreon so that people that really appreciate the podcast can, kind of like the Amanda Palmer model, like, and I know you also have a Patreon as well, but if people like your stuff, they're going to pay you for it. Like, if all you have to do is ask, right? And for the most part, that's worked out pretty well. If anything, I guess I feel like I have an unwritten contract with the people that are supporting me that says, hey, we're going to pay you to produce content on a weekly basis. And on my end, I'm going to try to uphold that as best as I can. And to your point, it is very tough. I mean, just the logistics of emails and texts and trying to get people to schedule and arrange and trying to find a time that works for both of you, and the technology and helping people navigate. Does your microphone work? There's a lot to it for sure. And not only that, but also the editing after the podcast is completed. So yeah, it is a lot of work, but I will tell you, it's so funny. I kind of contradict myself a little bit because I was talking about like what motivates you. If it's money, that's weird, but it's nice to have money. I don't feel ashamed to ask people for money, but I would say the non-financial rewards of having this podcast have been immeasurable. So I've developed a lot of relationships with a lot of fantastic people and artists and photographers out there that I wouldn't have if I didn't have this project. I think it's opened up some dialogue about some topics that are near and dear to my heart and my mind that I think is benefiting the landscape community. So I don't know. I want to keep that going because I get a lot of, I'd say 90% of the feedback I get is positive, which is cool. So I want to keep that going. And it's not for myself, but it's bigger than just me.
Yeah. You mentioned getting laid off, and I can imagine that considering how you came up, you mentioned both of your parents at one point getting laid off simultaneously, that you yourself getting laid off could be a big trigger for a lot of fear, a lot of financial insecurity. But how helpful was it that you had a passion that you were invested in? How did that help in terms of contending with not only the circumstances of being laid off, but also whatever feelings that might bring up?
I mean, it definitely helped in terms of having something I could even contemplate focusing my energy into in terms of allaying some of those fears and insecurities that you're describing, because those absolutely happened. I mean, there is no way that my wife could have supported us on just her income. I mean, we had just bought a house. It was just really bad timing. Yeah, I mean, truthfully, it was definitely a blessing to be able to have that to kind of fall back onto, because a lot of the people that like my photography throughout the years kind of saw that, I kind of put it out there like, hey, I got laid off. If you've ever wanted to buy any of my photos, this is probably a good time if you want to help me out. And I had a lot of people help me out. I mean, I got really lucky. I think I had, I want to say like 8 or 9 print sales in January alone. And I mean, I actually made more money on photography in January than I had like the whole previous year, just because I could put my energy into it more, and probably helped that I could get people to help me out. But on the flip side of that, I'm relatively risk averse in terms of like, you hear about a lot of people going full time as a landscape photographer, and I interview a lot of people that have done that recently and kind of listened to their struggles, and it's definitely not all puppy dogs and ice cream when it comes to running your own business as a photographer. I spent a lot of time and thought and energy into thinking about, could I make this work full time? Like, could this be something I do? And on one hand, it was really nice to be able to have that freedom to think about being able to do that. On the other hand, I was like, there's so many risks there that it just freaked me out. Like, it scared me. So I decided not to do that.
No, but but I think that is that's a choice that everybody needs to make, and that going full time is not for everyone. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a successful creative career as a photographer. That's one of the things I really like about today's age of photography. Even though some people say photography is dead, Wim Wenders this week said as much because of the smartphone generation, but I don't agree with that. But I think that there's so much that photography can be to a person's life beyond simply being able to earn a living from it, and that increasingly I'm seeing that is just as valid as someone who earns a living full time from making photographs. And I think that part of that is that because of the internet and YouTube, and people are realizing that it's not just making pictures 24/7, that there's a lot involved in creating a career. And some people are just saying, I don't want to do that. I just want to enjoy making photographs and sharing them. There's no shame in that,
No, not at all. I mean, and to your point, I've spoken with a lot of photographers that, landscape photography, or I mean, really any form of photography this could apply to, but it means a lot more to them. It has nothing to do with money. It's like they've had depression, maybe they've had social anxiety, maybe they've had health issues. Like, photography can help people overcome all kinds of trials and tribulations in their life. And I think that's really exciting to know that people can do that photography can be that vehicle for people to enhance their life. And, that's why I get into all these debates online about post-processing and all this stuff. And at the end of the day, I do feel like, if photography and creating art, whether that art is something that we agree looks good or not, or whatever, if that has a secondary purpose or even a primary purpose for that person in terms of overcoming something in their life, then who cares, right? Like, yeah. More power to them to be able to do that. I think we have to keep that in the back of our minds all the time. Like, we don't necessarily know why someone is taking photos or why they're processing in a certain way. Like, yeah.
Yeah, as long as they're doing what they love, man, life is too short not to.
Yeah.
So my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore, and it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
Yeah, so one photographer. I knew you were going to ask this question, and I should have done a little bit more thought into it, because I asked the same question on my podcast. So it's like I have all these names that run through my head all the time. I think one person that would be really interesting for your guests to hear from, he's a photographer out of the United Kingdom. His name is Alex Nail. He does a lot of similar photography as me, only it's way better. Like he does a lot of time-lapse photography. But what makes him really interesting is that he's incredibly articulate in terms of talking about digital manipulation and a natural representation of landscapes that I think is pretty counter to kind of what the mainstream thought is right now in terms of whatever goes. I think he has some compelling ideas and thoughts on that particular topic that he articulates it in a way that I don't think anyone else is able to right now. So he'll be interesting.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for making time with us, man. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I've been a huge fan of your podcast ever since I got into photography. I've been listening to your podcast. So keep up the good work. I just hope to hear from more landscape photographers on here as well.
Past episodes, where I've shared some of my personal journey and thoughts, have received some of the bigger responses from listeners. I've been both humbled and surprised that these episodes have resonated with so many of you. And though I still want the Candid Frame to be more about my guest than about me, I thought I'd add an occasional new segment where I offer you observations, reviews, and commentary, not just about photography, but anything that I find interesting, inspirational, or just downright fun. We call it The Last Frame. I recently received a copy of Dotun Sagai's new book, Venice Beach, The Last Days of a Bohemian Paradise. It's a beautiful book that captures a unique and very special part of Los Angeles. As I flipped through those pages, I was reminded not only of the photographic richness that's there, but how this small stretch of beachfront has for decades brought together people who would otherwise never cross paths. Venice is a special kind of people magnet that draws every kind of person imaginable. It's a complex mix of race, ethnicity, age, and culture. If Los Angeles is a segregated and compartmentalized city, Venice Beach, at least in my lifetime, is the antithesis of that. It was one of the things that fascinated me as a kid when my family and I would travel there. We'd start at Santa Monica Pier and then walk the 2.7 miles to arrive to a world that was unlike anything I was used to in South LA. I was enamored not only by the rich diversity of people, but especially all those characters, the bodybuilders, the roller skaters, the street performers, and of course, the impossibly beautiful men and women who walked past, wearing virtually nothing. But Venice was more than just a source of amusement or recreation for me. It offered times when my family would be out, doing something together. There had been plenty of that when we were younger, but as time passed and my parents' relationship became more and more strained, such moments became few and far between. Instead, my brothers and I would find our own diversions, our own distractions, which, at least for me, led to a lot of isolation. Years later, after my parents had divorced and I had graduated college, my brothers and I decided to take a trip to the beach, to spend time walking along the same path we had done as kids. It had been years since we had done anything together, and though we never verbalized it to each other, I think each of us wanted a moment where we could be together as a family again. As we walked down the path, I noticed to my right a young blonde girl around 6 or 7, sitting at a collapsible card table, appearing to be selling something. There were a few people around her looking at whatever she had to sell. I looked at the sign, which read, "Shells for sale." I kept walking, and then I thought, wait a second. This girl is selling seashells at the beach. There had to be a story there, and so I approached her and asked her what she was doing. She explained that she was selling shells just like the sign said. But I asked her, why would I want to buy a shell from you if I could pick up one for free just a few yards away? She explained that these shells were not from here, but from back east, where she and her family had been vacationing. I then asked her how much money she had made, and she told me over $30. I was impressed. I told her that I'd buy one, but only if I could also make her photograph. She agreed, and I got a shell, and she got another $1. I spotted a man who I assumed was her father sitting in a lawn chair beneath the shade of a tree, and I asked him to flesh out the story for me. And as she had told me, she began picking up shells while on their trip. And she told her father that when they got home, she intended to sell these shells at the beach. He had no idea where she had gotten the idea from. But as she gathered more and more shells, he could see that she was pretty serious about this. I think that he expected that she would forget about it when they got home, because it was weeks after they had returned before she eventually set up her table. Though he didn't say as much, I suspected that he hoped that she would forget about it. Because how crazy is that? If anyone told you that they were going to start a business selling shells at the beach, imagine what you'd think. The idea is laughable. It's idiotic. There's no way that something as stupid as that could work. Yet, in the few hours that she had been there, and by the time I found her, her silly idea had paid off. Later, when I processed the film and got prints made, I sent her and her family a copy of the print. I soon received a thank you letter from the girl's father, telling me that his daughter now displayed the photo in a frame next to her bedside. That was over 25 years ago. And during that time, my thoughts have often returned to that young girl and her impossible idea. Whenever I'm working towards something that I want to achieve and experience those moments of self-doubt and insecurity, when I have those moments that tempt me to simply give up or move on to something else, I think about her. I think of her when I want to give up or not put in that extra bit of effort, or when I try to convince myself that abandoning a dream is somehow more bearable than failure. But that's not true. It isn't true for me now, and it sure wasn't true for that little blonde girl selling shells at the beach. I wish I still had that letter, because I would love to find her to learn what kind of woman she's grown up to be. And as I go through my old slides and negatives, I hold out hope that I'll find that strip of negatives and make another print, which I'll place on my desk. And I'll look at it, and I'll be reminded that striving for the impossible can be a wonderful and perfect thing. That's the last frame. Thanks to Matt for spending time with us. To find out more about Matt and his work, visit mattpaynephotography.com. And remember to check out his podcast, F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen. If you're a fan of The Candid Frame, take the time today to write a review in the iTunes Store. It helps our ranking, but it also helps create awareness of the show. Though it only takes a few minutes, you'll be making a huge difference. Take the time to do it today. You can also support the show by making a monthly contribution through Patreon. For as little as $2 a month, you help us to not only meet the cost of production, but help us to bring you these episodes each week. Or if you just want to make a one-time contribution, you can do so via PayPal. It was your support that allowed us to create the free Candid Frame app that provides the easiest way to access every episode of The Candid Frame. Available for both Apple iOS and Android, you automatically receive the latest episode on your phone or tablet. You can easily search for any episode based on name or keyword and save your favorite episode for repeated listening. Download it today by clicking on the link in the show notes or the website at thecandidframe.com. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at simply @IbadianX. And this is IbadianX, and this is The Candid Frame.